I think it gets at how thorny it is to talk about motherhood because we have never really given it the curiosity it deserves.
Yeah,
It's pivoted from the fairy tale version, which is
yeah,
flat, the selfless, altruistic fairy tale version, to the nightmare version and a competitive sport. So now to
hmm
say I'm a good mother, I do it. I think of myself as a good mother. I
yeah,
say that though, I hesitate to say that because I know that the culture we live in presents motherhood as a competitive sport and
yeah,
not a relationship and
yeah,
something with instrumental outcomes. So I'm a good mom because my kids are successful in X, Y, and Z. That's not why I'm saying it, but that's how it
yeah,
might be interpreted.
yeah.
When I
It,
say I'm a good mom, for me, it's because it's something I deeply invest in, and it's a huge meaning making experience for me.
yeah. I finished the book this morning. I had pages and pages and pages and pages of quotes and notes that I'm going to try to get through a lot of. And I really, really liked it. And the first thing I
Oh,
said to
thank you.
Ernie is make sure we include this book in our book club. It has to be read. We take our favorite books and we have a book club that sort of rhymes with my um, well, it's not my podcast, but my commentary, it has to be said. So we have an it has to be read book club and we pick books and then we further promote them and do stuff with them. So I really like this book.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, I just think
Yeah.
it's terrific. And it was so funny. I mean, I'm going to introduce you properly in a minute, but it was so funny because in reading your book, um, it seemed, I don't know if mathematically this is correct, but half the people you quote are people I've interviewed.
I
So,
believe,
so I
yeah.
kept running into people's books, Eve Rodsky, you know, Berg and Wise Men, what are children for? Ruth Whitman, who I just interviewed about Boy Mom, and it was like, wait a minute, so the list was just so familiar. And I told Ernie, I said, how did we get Alyssa? Was it, you know, Eve Rodsky? He said, no, Ruth Whitman told us that we should interview her. So, you've got a good mafia out there supporting you.
Yeah, Ruth's a dear friend of mine. And we kind of wrote these books together in a way, just through COVID, texting with each other all day. So,
Yeah, well,
yeah.
they interface very well. And I had a really good time interviewing her and anyway, so let me do this the way you're supposed to because we're a serious outfit here.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Elissa Strauss. And Alyssa is a writer covering the politics and culture of parenting and caregiving. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Glamour, Elle, CNN.com, and Slate. And what we're here today all about is she is the author of When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others. And as I was mentioning to Alyssa a moment ago, we've interviewed a whole bunch of authors recently, Berg and Wise Men and Brodsky, Ruth Whitman, etc. So we didn't do this on purpose, but we interview a lot of authors who write about this subject, including demographers like Paul Morland from the UK, who's probably the British leading demographer, Tomorrow's People, No One Left. Tia Leving's a well-trained wife coming from a kind of an evangelical background. We just seem to be doing a lot of this. Either there are a lot of these books or because we talk to a lot of these authors, they kind of refer us to each other. But I just finished Alyssa's book this morning, and I have a lot of quotes from it. Before we dive in, I just want to say, please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts if you're watching or listening there, and to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And we're probably going to be able to put your book in as a December offering to our book club. It has to be read. And I think it came out, if I'm correct, in April this year.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not brand new, but newish. Anyway, thank you for being here. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to jump right into the book. I have some quotes here. I read it on Kindle, which the disadvantage is I can't hold the book up and prove it by putting all the dog-eared pages in front of you. But
Yeah.
trust me, it's been well read and well thumbed. So what I want to just talk about is a kind of a setup on the book. the way the publisher sets it up is like this. In this urgent and necessary book, New York Times bestselling author, journalist Alyssa, that's by Rebecca Traister, and journalist Elissa Strauss explores the powerful role caring for others plays in our individual and communal lives, weaving together research and stories from parents and caregivers with a feminist bent. Behind our current caregiving crisis, in which broken system has left parents and caregivers exhausted, sits a fierce addiction to independence. But what would happen if we started to appreciate dependency? Okay, that's the boilerplate. Now here comes something from the book, and let me see where I pulled this from. Pretty deep into the text, I think around page 250. When caregivers are welcome, their voices can move from the margins to the center of the conversation. They become the experts and authorities, the ones who pick which ancient text to focus on, and the ones who decide which light to frame that text in. They point out when and where care is hiding in plain sight and encourage us to start care-inspired conversations that were systematically excluded for centuries. And then in quotes, what would it mean to put my Bubba, I guess, or however you say that, grandma and her sisterhood friends on the same level as a rabbi, to think of them as someone who has something that should be passed on as well? Benjamin wonders, this is out of a conversation. I imagine those caregivers would have a lot to say. Care is about life, death, joy, strength, weakness, pain, and surrender. And that's not in the beginning of the book. And I do have a lot of quotes from the way you set it up, but I love that paragraph because it's kind of a summation and gets into something I want to talk about with you on a personal note here. And that is not just caregiving from the point of view of parenthood, but as someone who spent the last 16 years being the primary child caregiver for 3 of my 5 grandchildren who literally live across the street, that I cook for, care for, do all the things that make for a childhood. One huge thing, and you refer to it in the book when you talk about grandparents a bit, one of the connections that's been lost in the caregiving environment is the intergenerational connection that was taken for granted in most cultures going back to hunter-gatherer. It isn't just that men participated in caregiving, which we'll talk about, before, and up to the industrial age in a way that they don't now. But it was assumed that grandparenting was caregiving to young children. That was the assumption, be it an old Italian farm or a community of hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert, anywhere you look. That's what older people did. They took the wisdom and the life knowledge. So, whether it was breastfeeding or delivery or rudimentary gynecology, somebody was around who had been there and done this. So the village was always intergenerational. So I sort of want to start there because you refer a little bit to that, but I think it's a thread that ties together a lot of the books I've been reading and talking to authors about. So I want to launch with that. And you talk about your own mom, conversations with her that you found frustrating at one time because she's a lot more interested in how are the kids doing than she is in what did you just write for the New York Times? And eventually you're reconciled to that. And of course, that's the essential of intergenerational care. I'm interested in how my grandchildren are doing in school, but what I'm really interested in is just being with them and getting to know them and being their friend and all the things that go with that. So I think that theme is where I'd like to start. Anyway, does that ring any bells?
Yeah, I think it's really beautiful. And I'll start with a story I heard from Alison Gopnik. You might be familiar with her work. She's a cognitive psychologist. She wrote a great book called The Philosophical Baby and a book about parenting called The Carpenter and the Gardener. And I was talking to her about how I feel like there's this actually direct connection between our current obsession with living forever, which is, there's a best-selling book out called Outlive. The people who have more money than they know what to do with these days, that the thing they do with their money, if they're not, flying into space, is trying to biohack to figure out how to make their body last forever.
Sure.
And I feel like within that is just this total denial that we're human creatures that need and bleed and die, right? You can biohack all you want. Maybe I'm small-minded, but I don't think we're outwitting mortality. And so there's just this obsession with living forever. And Alison Gopnik told me that she was doing a talk at Google And this came up, that if someone had kids, if they spent their life caring, it might make them live less long. That it get, even though actually the research suggests otherwise, but
Yeah.
in that kind of biohack, like everything has to be monitored and made as efficient as possible
Mm.
mentality, children get in the way. And she said to them, well, if you have kids, that is another way to be
Sure.
immortal. Like your body doesn't live forever, but your values and your beliefs and to whatever degree, she didn't speak in the language of spirit and
Yeah.
soul, but for those of us for whom that means something, your spirit and soul like live on. You
Sure.
transpose some of it through care. And the guy just didn't, like didn't know what to do with it. This like,
Hmm.
Google exec. And then he's like, I think it's better just to focus on my diet and exercise. Like it could not be comprehended.
Yeah.
And I love that story because it really gets at how care is just this central both tool and vehicle for kind of our being and survival on this planet. It's like evidence of existence. And, I
Yeah.
think so much of what we think of as evidence of our existence, or our purpose, or our meaning is rooted in like our individual productivity. What did we
Mm.
do? And not in the connections that we have with others, and particularly care, where we're enabling someone else to survive or thrive and live with dignity.
Yeah. And reading a level of joy and contentment in them that we relate to directly because, I just fixed her lunch and she knows I cooked for her and we're sitting down and talking. The reward for that kind of thing. I'm a father of three grown kids and five grandchildren, and I know it sounds a bit hyperbolic or sort of like your example, someone saying, "Oh, I don't get that. What do you mean? You'd rather be uploaded to your grandchildren's brains than to a computer." Speaking for myself, I would rather be,
That's a great way
and
to
their
put it. Yeah.
hearts.
Yeah.
But the happiest moments in my life, I'm sitting over there looking at a self-portrait my 16-year-old granddaughter made for me for my birthday. I just turned 72. And I kind of touched that on the way out of the room like an icon. I don't know where any of the reviews of my novels are. I mean, seriously, like I know I've had some good ones and I've sold some books and other books as well, but none of them become sort of talismans of this is why I'm here. And the other day, she gave a great compliment to my wife, Jeannie. Just conversationally, she didn't understand how this would impact my wife, who's 73. She said, "Oh, my friends and me were talking, and they all know us because we're such a part of their life." And we were comparing notes on who we know who's old, quote unquote, because Jeannie and me are old. Um, and the other girls, she has about six friends, they all hang out together, high school friends, were saying, "Well, who of everybody in our circle would you like to be like when you're old?" And they all agreed, it was unanimous, that they want to be like you. My granddaughter told Jeannie, they want to be like you, Nana. They all agreed that when they're old, they want to be like you. And I was thinking of that kind of intergenerational passing on of not just wisdom, but a kind of a meaning for life, a meaning, people who have a sense of the meaning of life invested in those relationships. Well, they talk about her that way because we're invested in their lives because Lucy brings her friends over here. And so Jeannie is known to these teenagers. She's, quote, an old lady. They're looking to her for something. And again, she just took so much meaning from that. It was such a lovely thing to have happen, and so out of sync with the way we define success. It's a funny thing. I was looking at your bio on Amazon, and they were defining you as a writer. And I was thinking to myself that if someone actually read the book, they would have said that they would have put who you are as well, as a human, that you're someone who cares about your children, you're involved in a marriage, which, you have, in other words, even in the midst of pitching a book on
Yeah.
connection, they're pitching you is in exactly the kind of bloodless, forlorn way that we all get pitched in terms of who are you? We mean, what do you do as a career? We don't really mean who you are.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it gets at how thorny it is to talk about motherhood because we have never really given it the curiosity it deserves.
Yeah,
It's pivoted from the fairy tale version, which is
yeah,
flat, the selfless, altruistic fairy tale version to the nightmare version and a competitive sport. So now to
Hmm.
say I'm a good mother, I do it. I think of myself as a good mother. I
Yeah.
say that though, I hesitate to say that because I know that the culture we live in presents motherhood as a competitive sport and
Yeah.
not a relationship and
Yeah.
something with instrumental outcomes. So I'm a good mom because my kids are successful in X, Y, and Z. That's not why I'm saying it, but that's how it
Yeah.
might be interpreted.
Yeah.
When I
It,
say I'm a good mom, for me, it's because it's something I deeply invest in, and it's a huge meaning making experience for me.
yeah.
And I feel that I've authentically, and I was just talking to one of my favorite care ethicists, one of these philosophers who work on care. We were talking about like what is good care, and for her, it's like if you can then give someone else the ability to make meaning for themselves,
Hmm.
that's good care. Um, and I right, so I'm a good mom by that metric, and I'm proud to say that because I invest a lot. I get great meaning. I wrestle
Yeah.
with myself through my care I give my kids, and I feel as though I've opened up ways for them to make their own meaning and then teach me in return.
Yeah, you have a little passage here again. It's from later in the book. My newfound revulsion to certainty, I love that phrase, may have had as much to do with the circumstances of opinion writing as it did with the way caring for my children filled me with a longing somehow, somewhere, to return to a purer state of human connection, not unlike that which I experienced when being cared for as a child. I remember the power of one person seeing another. I love that. And I just want you to talk about that a little bit because it's a very powerful little passage. I mean, it went by quickly, and then I just stopped and said, no, I'm pulling that one out. We're going to talk about it. The power of that, your own childhood connecting with you now being the caregiver. And I just love that.
So that was my first big epiphany, so to speak, from parenthood.
Yeah.
And it sounds so simple. And it's something we all know, and yet we
Yeah.
don't, and then we don't know at all that people are different than us.
Hmm.
That's the big aha.
Yeah.
And when I had my son Augie, the type of writing I did was what was called hot takes in the 2010s. I made a decent living off of having strong opinions every day. I mean, this
Sure.
was, and that kind of journalism, for good reason, has kind of fallen out of fashion, but that's what I did. And I lived in a
Yeah.
place where certainty was rewarded. And I had this kid who saw the world differently than me. And it's something when someone cares for you,
Mm.
you are required to like attempt at least to enter into their subjective experience more than in other relationships. Even,
Yes.
you do it in friendship? Yes. Should you
Yeah.
do it in marriage? Yes. But when you care for someone, you're really to give them anything that resembles good care, you really need to try to see the world through their eyes.
Yeah.
And in trying to see the world through my first son's eyes, who is a deeply careful thinker and remains so to this day. I would not be
Mm.
surprised if he becomes an analytic philosopher one day. Deeply careful thinker. Um, he wasn't uncertain in the way that he was insecure and nervous.
Mm.
He
Sure.
really wanted to understand everything
Hmm.
before he decided upon anything. And trying to see the world through his eyes held a mirror back up to me, and it made
Yeah.
me realize that the kind of writing I was doing was maybe, I mean, I'll start with the word boring even. That like
Yeah.
what fun is it to live a life where you think you know everything? What do we
Yeah.
get from that? And
Yeah.
so I joke that, having kids ruined my career, but not in the way you think,
Mm.
because I did lose an edge as a writer through my experience of care and becoming
Mm.
a thinker that wants to appreciate other people's realities and not just get stuck in my own.
Yeah.
The world rewards big, bold, ideas that
Yeah.
say this is right and this is wrong. But it doesn't matter. Like I don't want to go back to being that kind of writer. And
Mm.
I appreciate so much how much my kids constantly make me challenge who I am in this world, what I believe in this world,
Yeah.
and in ways small and large.
Well, you have a lot of passages in the book, and I'll quote some. We can get to that, but talking about how artists, the idea of can you be an artist and a mother, these two things are, in opposition to each other. And then you talk about the fact, well, why can't you be both? And also how people are disparaged to allow, God forbid, sentimentality, to creep in as it would be labeled by someone else, that this has to be this kind of hard, pure um, statement. So that's a theme in the book. But I want to go back into what you're talking about, certainty. The deeper I got into caring for those two distinct individuals, that's your children, the more I began to question the certainty I paraded around in my writing. How could I be so sure how the world was? And was how I saw the world really how others should or could see it? What if I led with the question rather than the answer? I love that.
Oh, thank you.
Such a wonderful passage. So just talk a little more about that, and then we'll move on.
I think for me, it became this whole orientation in the world. And
Mm,
it's again, we talk about care, the kind of stakes of care, the stakes of motherhood in particular are so stark. It's like you're working or you're not working, you're this or you're that. And for me, there it was the challenges and the questions that motherhood was arising myself. There was for sure some of that. It's practically inconvenient to have a child compared to your life before you had a child. You do need to figure out support and caregiving if you plan on working, which I always did, and all that. So there was that whole bucket of questions, and they were
yeah.
very real. And in many ways, I was lucky to be able to have the support that I did.
Mm,
It's not easy in this country to find the right support as parents.
right,
But
right.
right, but beyond that, there's a whole other terrain of these questions.
Hmm.
And for me, it was really just kind of so spiritually and philosophically liberating to
Yeah,
be in them and to not resent my kids for not being the people I wanted them to be,
yeah.
and to allow actually the engagements with them
Hmm.
to be this kind of philosophical opening. And
Yeah.
it made parenting also so much more interesting when you view it through
Hmm.
that lens. I feel like when I let parenting become big, that's when I really started to like parenting. When I kept it
Hmm.
small and instrumental, and I thought of parenting as this outcome-based thing that my kids should be behaving this way or they should like
Hmm.
these things because I like them, parenting felt a lot more stressful. But
Yeah.
when I took it to the plane of like reading a really hard book, the kind of book that you may avoid unless you were assigned in a college class, like
Hmm.
this true journey of the self and the other, and again, just making it bigger in that sense, then parenting became much more exciting for me. I realized how many parts of our brain actually it can tap into when we let
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. You have an interesting thing here. I was just going to read because it kind of is a ramp to a different subject, and that is the way caregiving is perceived. For the last few minutes, you and I have been talking about our views and your view in particular expressed in the book of caregiving and what you've learned from it. Here's a passage that kind of leads to another place. I understand the need for care. I understand the need for the caregivers are miserable narrative for political purposes. The world should understand how hard the majority of caregivers have it in a country that offers them no support or for the paid ones a living wage. At the same time, it felt like we were losing something here when the primary word we associate with care is burden. We demean the experience. And then you go on and you talk about the fact I often struggle. I struggle with this language often. When I meet other parents or caregivers, too old or ill or disabled individuals, there is often an awkward moment when I or someone else asks them what they do and they stumbled to respond. Maybe one or two, as far as I can remember, told me directly without hesitation that they spend their days caring. The rest mentioned that their caregiving amid a long list of qualifiers, regrets, and apologies. They were taking time off to care, the off implying that the care is secondary, the accident or hiccup to the work they think will impress you. And that's kind of an exit ramp to a subject of how caregiving is perceived. Really beautifully written passage again. Um, so let's go there for a little bit. Talk about your journey, but your journey is not not in a vacuum. You start your book, and I've got a lot of passages from that part too, with a kind of a rethink of some of the feminist writers from the 1960s and 70s, in particular, maybe the 80s and 90s as well. Not that you're rejecting everything that they did, but putting in perspective that again, kind of like the idea, you don't make this analogy, I don't think, but sort of like the billionaire tech bros deciding to upload their brains to live forever somehow the feminists forgot that actual biology and the way we were built by evolution to care for each other, which is the only reason you and I are having this conversation. Someone took care of us rather than doing
Right.
some big fancy thing, or we wouldn't be talking. It goes back to Margaret Mead, the first healed femur, and so forth and so on. But what I was trying to say is that one of the burdens of caring today, and I even feel that as a 72-year-old grandfather, let alone as a mother, this particular category of caregiver, that the context in which we're trying to do this, say as a male, I have a son who was a Marine who fought in Afghanistan, who's the father of these kids who live across the street. There's a certain type of male I meet that wants to know all about, oh, your son was a Marine, like somehow that's the thing. Not so much, I'm fixing lunch for his 10-year-old again today and homesick from school. I took her to the doctor's appointment, got the strep test. Actually, that's what both my Marine son and me care more about. But in a certain context, to be manly, I've got to be more on like, oh, he's a former Marine. And you've got to be, oh, I'm this New York Times fancy writer that gets published everywhere. And we both have to somehow like, oh, now you're past that because you've written a book explaining it, and I am too because I've written about this and talk about it. But it's almost like a secret society. You get underneath, okay, who are you? Not what do you do? What do you really care about? And I love your book for that because it opens that question for anyone who reads it. Okay, that was too long, but sorry.
I think, they often take people to a dinner party, and on one side of the table, you have a man that just hiked Mount Everest or,
Right.
biked the coast of Italy or did something like that. That's kind of
Yeah.
physically adventurous and demanding. And on the other side of the table, you have a dad that's taking paternity leave. And it's maybe his wife took it the first 3 months, he's doing the second 3 months, and he's busy with a baby. You'll ask right, like, who are we really paying attention to at that table? Who are we looking at as someone who's doing something important and really matters?
Yeah.
Probably the guy who just hiked Mount Everest, right? It's like that's a mountain that we see as important to climb.
Yeah.
Care is not a mountain that we
Yeah.
see as important to climb. And I want to be clear, both are hard. There are times when you climb Mount Everest and you climb the Everest,
Yeah.
quote unquote, of caregiving, and you don't want to be there, and your feet hurt, and you're exhausted, and you wish nothing more that you could be home, watching Netflix. But we don't look at the real Everest as just because it's hard, it's not meaningful or matter. We understand that the challenges are part of what it makes it meaningful and matter.
Yeah.
But when we think about the care Everest, we're often so quick to assume that just because it is challenging and inconvenient, so to speak, then it must not have greater import. Or the greater import lies only in self-sacrifice. It's an altruistic act. One of my favorite care ethicists, Maurice Hamilton, says, care is not altruism. I think it's such a beautiful distinction.
Right.
Because when we see that Everest, right, the care Everest, as just, you do it because you're selfless, and this is all about just giving to the other, giving, and you cannot complain. We minimize and flatten what it's really about. Care is an exchange. We give and we get. We grow and we shrink in all sorts of ways while we're doing it. So what I would love for nothing more is for my book to help create a world and a culture in which we have just as many questions and we give just as much curiosity and respect to care Mount Everest as real Mount Everest. Because I don't know, I've never hiked Mount Everest, but I have a hunch that, they're both as meaty and mighty as one another, even if in different ways.
One of the things you talk about in your book, I don't have the passage ready here, but it's in my list of quotes here, but you go into some detail about the kind of economic disparity of women or men, for that matter, or grandfathers, in my case, taking care of children. It's not an economic activity. It's not measured. But if I got hired and was being paid to do the same job, say, as an after-school program, my local public school that I'm involved with, now I'm part of the economy. But actually, I'm doing that job right now here because taking a child to a doctor's office, cooking them a meal, teaching my grandson carpentry, and to cook or whatever it may be. This is actually an economic activity that ripples through the whole economy. I don't want to go there in detail because it's a bit dry, but just verify the fact there's a big chunk of your book that actually is a very good study. It could sort of be taken out as a monograph about that. And I really liked it. I just tell people I'm telling the truth. It's in your book.
Yeah, I'll just say one quick thing, right? So when women really entered the workforce in the
Yeah.
70s in significant numbers, if economists said that, like, oh, look, productivity is going up. But later, when economists went back and actually tried to value the work that had been done in the
Hmm.
home, they realized, in fact, productivity may have gone down. So when we
Yeah.
don't value care through economic measures, we actually have an incomplete picture of our economy. And
Yes.
and on
Yeah.
top of that, we have a sense that taking your kid to the doctor is not part of participating and doesn't matter in a capitalist system. Whereas if you worked at a daycare and put a band-aid on a kid,
Sure.
it would. So it's broken for us as people living in
Yeah.
capitalism and wanting to matter, and it's broken for us as a society that's understanding how our economy works.
Yeah. And it's not just a question of respect. It's also a question of just we haven't even built the machinery with which to see clearly what caregiving represents in our economy, which in a way is the least interesting part of any discussion because it's about the money, but it is about the money. And the way
It's
you
about,
see
yeah.
that actually makes a difference to the value and the respect you give something that you see reflected in the caregivers, reimbursement and teacher salaries and all the rest. I just want to reintroduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is Elissa Strauss. Alyssa is a writer who does many, many important and fancy things, throw in the New York Times thing and all the rest of it. But big news here is she's the author of When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others. It is a terrifically written book. Oh, and I apologize. I read it on Kindle. Hold it up again. I was going to ask you at the beginning. There's the cover. And it's a wonderful book. So please subscribe right now to YouTube and In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, where I do my political commentaries, etc. at frankschaeffer.substack.com. This book, When You Care, is going to be our It Has to Be Read December offering. We are going to be back promoting it, and we'll re-invite you, Alyssa, back maybe on a panel with maybe Eve Rodsky or Berg or Weisman or Ruth Whitman would be a good person since she's a friend of yours. But anyway, we'll put something together to re-promote you. Okay, having said that, I want to dive back into the book. Okay, so this part of your book, as you know, I'll reverse the usual description. It's not, this is not business, this is personal, because now we're into my territory. The men I know, you write, have embraced care for many of the obvious reasons, like loving the people they care for and wanting to see them thrive. But, and this is the bit I really love here, less expected, less discussed, is the way that being a caregiver gives them a free pass to explore and embrace these non-macho selves and find a way to connect more deeply within and without. For my father, brothers, husband, male friends, the Rwandan man, and so many more, you have a story about Rwanda in there, care is the place where it becomes okay to be and become more fully themselves. And I'll just add on a personal note, beyond what you wrote there, more fully human and more connected to the entire history of the human race. So that when I read one of my favorite books, which is The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, about her 2 years in the Kalahari Desert with the Bushmen who had been there for the last 80,000 years, literally 80,000. Her dad founded Raytheon, and she was there in the 50s with these people before anybody else had. When she recounts the interaction between the males and the females in that hunter-gatherer group of about 19, 20, 25 people moving around together, they reflect everything that supposedly modern feminism hoped to achieve and hasn't. The men do care for the kids, but not because somebody read a book and said you should do this. Your kids die if everybody doesn't pitch in, literally. The old people are respected because, as one young person says when asked by her father how he knows something, he says, "Oh, I don't know that yet." And the father says, "Well, why not?" And he says, "The old people have not told me yet."
Hmm.
So the passing on of the wisdom and the intergenerational thing. So when I read your passage, I would just say it's more than just connecting with a better, softer, gentler, kinder side. It's actually connecting with something deeper that goes back pre-industrial, when families all worked a family farm together, and everybody was in this, shop that you were making shoes in before it was industrialized, whatever it might be. So I love that bit of your book because you don't leave us behind, us being males. You don't leave fathers and grandfathers who love children and their wives and their families behind. I love your book for that because you embrace the other half of humanity in a way often too shamefully. That other half, being the male half, has not embraced the women in our lives and the caregiving aspects of their lives. So thanks for your generosity in that, because it's not just that passage. You pull us in all through the book, and I really appreciate that. I think it opens a lot of doors for people, but I just think you did a wonderful thing there.
Oh, thank you for saying that. And, I think 40% of family caregivers for adult parents are men. And while fathers are certainly not doing enough to alleviate women of the mental load, as Eve Brodsky talks often about, or really help moms have equal footing in the labor force, there's still room to grow.
Yeah,
But at the same time, fathers are doing so much more than they have in generations. They're doing way more than their dads did, and they're doing way more than their grandfathers did. So I
yeah.
think and we have to ask ourselves, what's that like for them, and have
Hmm.
curiosity about it. Again, this is reoccurring themes for me. It's like, don't enter with certainty, enter with the curiosity.
Yeah,
And the more I speak to men about caregiving, the more I learn that for many of them, it really does matter. And it's something that they wish they could do more of, but they have intense jobs that just don't give them the time. Or they wish they could do more of, but they really were never taught how, and they're
yeah,
insecure about it.
yeah.
Or wish they could do more of and are doing more of. And I even notice a difference between, I'm 44, my husband's also 44, and the difference even between us and the 30 something, couples with tiny children that we see at our synagogue. I see the
Yeah.
dads running around after the kids during lunch, as much as the moms, even more. So I feel like we need to acknowledge that men are doing more and more care,
Hmm.
because when we only focus on what they're not doing, I think it can be actually reinforce the problem ultimately, and not acknowledging both the contributions, what they're getting from it, and also what they stand to get from it, and what's holding them back.
Yeah, you have a bit in your book somewhere where you talk about something that Eve Brodsky has brought up when I think either in conversation with her or when I read her book, but just this thing that, and this is not a big point, we're not going to go there long, but it's in your book, sort of women who ask men to do more caring and more help and clean up or load the dishwasher or something, and then later sort of stand back but are critical of what their partner or their husband is doing, whomever. Um, this becomes a little bit self-defeating, but then you kind of unpack that and you talk about the fact, and I thought you did this very well. Eve Brodsky doesn't do this, but you do this. Talk about the fact that one of the reasons for that happening is that if you have a fail in that area, the missed doctor's appointment, the kid is sick, or the house is a mess, or your child is not being raised, quote, properly, whatever, that in the end, they know they're going to get blamed more than the husband who was helping, who didn't do it right. So even though she looks as if she's trying to have her cake and eat it too, as in, okay, do more of this. Now I'm going to criticize you. That has to be unpacked honestly in a marriage or between a couple, because it's we can't pretend that the past didn't exist, where more recently in human history men had this more isolated, uncaring role. I don't know if you want to address that, but I just thought that was very brilliantly done, because you kind of talked about the problem, but you didn't leave it there. You weren't telling women, hey, shape up. If you're going to get help, you've got to stand back. Let's understand how the hurt that resides still in so many women marrying to these guys that just won't do shit. And now they finally are doing something, but they're doing it, not doing it as well. The woman knows that in the end, it's going to be the rap on her knuckles, often by other women who are very critical of women. I don't know if you
Right.
want to talk about that.
Yeah. So the phenomenon of sociologists call it maternal gatekeeping.
Yes, exactly. I love that phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's real, and empathy for all parties involved, right? If your
Yeah.
kids show up to a family wedding and your husband dressed them, and he never really paid attention before to
Right.
what
Socks don't
children wear to
match.
weddings, or the
Yeah.
socks don't match, and the shirt has a big stain, and
Hmm.
he just doesn't understand, because he's never had to think about this once in his life, why it's important for the kids to look a certain way.
Sure.
he felt like he did his best. He wrangled 3 kids into dress clothes. He's feeling pretty good about himself. And then the
Yeah,
wife is feeling frustrated because she
yeah,
knows the kid shows up and there's a stain, and all of her grandmothers and aunts are going to give her the stink eye because how
yeah.
could
Give
you
her
show
shit
up
about
to
it, right?
William's wedding like that? So
Yeah.
I think we have to understand the emotional dynamics behind the gender gap, basically. We
Hmm.
have to understand, not assume one party is evil, and on both sides, right? That
Right.
this is the controlling nag, right? That's the evil,
Yeah.
stereotypical woman, and the lazy, clueless lump of a human, which is the
Hmm.
husband, right? If not sometimes worse. But we have clueless dad and controlling mom, and really they're both stereotypes. And not when we think of either man or woman through those lens, we're not really arriving with empathy, and we're not
Hmm.
really arriving with an awareness that's actually going to help us solve the
Yeah.
problem. The
Yeah.
men
One of
need to
the,
understand why it matters to the woman, and the women need to understand
yeah.
why it matters to the men to get to go through trial and error a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. You talk about Berg and Wise Men. You say Berg alongside Rachel Wiseman, who I've interviewed here, writes about changing attitude toward children, parenthood, and family in contemporary society, and the value of having children in an imperfect world. There were numerous forces that taught me these lessons, most of which I wasn't conscious of until I began researching this book. Evolution, psychology, philosophy, theology, politics, and economics all write care out of the larger human story in subtle and not so subtle ways, which, by the way, brings me to another author I've interviewed here who has a book called Hannah's Children. And she did 50 interviews with 50 women around the country and some around the world as well, all of which were distinguished by the fact they had chosen to have 5 or more children, and all of whom were very educated women like yourself, who had made a life choice based on how they wanted to live their lives. And she herself has quite a few kids, and she was delving into that. But she's a professor of economics at Catholic University of America and is very specialized in that field. She's actually an economist writing as a mother about this subject that interests her because of her personal experience and basically trying to get an insight into this. So I always feel that her book is a kind of a bookend to your book or any other book on the subject, because it's like, okay, there are some people who have gone to the next step, as it were, saying, no, we are going to look at our ability, our fertility, and the joy we have in motherhood with all the pain. One of the things that's clear in our interviews is, no, this isn't easy. This is a tough choice, and there are a lot of times we wish we hadn't done this, but here's why we did. I just found her book very interesting and very revealing in terms of bringing a subject to the table that is, a bit taboo, like your dinner party where everybody's talking with the guy who climbed Mount Everest. Now, here a mother shows up saying, I have 5 kids and here's why. And by the way, I have a PhD in economics. And I found her work very interesting.
Yeah, I think that work really illustrates. I think the moms were they were all Catholic or mostly Catholic
No,
or,
there were mothers in Israel on kibbutzim, all sorts of people.
yeah. Um, I need to read that book. I've read about it and it sounds fascinating.
She's an
I
interesting
think,
person. You'd love her as a human. Forget the book for a minute, but
yeah,
but she's
I'm
great.
gonna reach out. So I think, often when you hear those cases, and I've read reviews of the book, but I have not read the book itself,
Yeah,
is that people are living inside a meaning making system, and it's often religion, in
right.
which like children matter. And I think in the broader, more secularized culture of the States, like we don't have shared meaning making systems in which children matter, in which
Yeah.
care matters. Now, this is the rub. I think a lot of the meaning making systems that allow care and children to matter also patriarchal. So
Hmm.
and so for me, part of like this project of this book is like, we've come this far with feminism. Can we now go back and be like, all right, let's allow for a system in which children and care really matter, but it's not something that subjugates women to men.
Sure, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I think that's the rub, and that's what I see. I'm most close with Orthodox Jews, and I think the strange thing sometimes is that in among that culture, I think they actually value care and motherhood more than we
Yeah.
value care and motherhood. It's genuinely seen as a soulful experience than in the more secularized or kind of loosely religious, cultures at that time. But the rub is right. They don't get to have the same power as men. They don't get to be rabbis. They don't get to lead
Right.
their community. So it's like, how can we, what can we do to move closer to a world in which we take the true value of care and children and also dignity and dying and caring for our elderly parents that comes from these old traditions that was very real and sustained, truly sustained humanity, like we've talked about forever. I mean, it's the secret to success, but untie them from patriarchy. And,
Yeah.
and that involves, of course, men doing more care, and also for care to be talked about and not just those religious systems, but also in philosophy, in
Hmm.
psychology, in the great book, things we consider the great books, in those dinner table conversations. And I feel like that really narrows down almost the heart of the project of this book, is trying to untangle care from the patriarchy and saying, like, yes, this is woman's work, traditionally speaking. Yes, it has great value and meaning.
Yeah.
And also, can we build a society where women get to be their full selves?
Well, the flip side to what you're saying is you make an effort to, I think, um, talk about feminism in a way that you say, from Marxist feminists and careerist feminists to novelists, bloggers, and random commentators on Facebook, everyone I came in contact with seemed to be in agreement on one thing, care and women's liberation were in opposition. But what if the problem wasn't so much care as it was the circumstances within which we give it and the unrealistic and emotionally hollow stories we tell ourselves about it? So, the only thing I wanted to say is that something you try to do in your book is not exactly reconcile feminism and where you are now in your journey, but show that, whether it's reaching back to men and saying, the patriarchy is not your friend either.
Right.
It's reaching to women who have been through the system. I mean, you talk about, gender studies or whatever, they might have come through, they never would have heard this or that or the other. But you're also saying, look, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater in any case, but there's a better way. So let me just sort of go there for a minute without going through a whole bunch of individual passages, which I do have here, but just let you talk a little bit about where you are right now, because life's a journey. I wrote a book called Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, having come from a very evangelical background. And I've gone in the opposite direction to you. I've become less and less religious, having grown up in a very strict fundamentalist background with a very famous evangelical father. And the roots of the fall of Roe v. Wade can be traced to the work we did in the 70s and 80s with C. Everett Koop and Ronald Reagan and others. That's a different story. But I'm on a different trajectory. But the funny thing is, I describe myself as an atheist who prays, and people say, "Well, how can you possibly pray?" I remember Chris Hitchens asking me that, part of the new atheist movement. Why aren't you one of us? I said, because I wasn't raised that way.
Yeah.
So why pretend you're something you're not? So you come from a feminist background, and I would still consider you a feminist. I would just say,
Yeah, me
if
too.
someone asked me, is Elissa Strauss a feminist? I'd say, yeah, it's just she interprets what a feminist is differently than maybe she did 15 years ago. I don't know, would I be saying something true or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, sometimes I think of just this almost as think of it as a journey through a physical space, right? So it's like women wanted to leave the house for good reason. They had all these other parts of themselves that were not allowed to be explored when women were expected to only stay home and do domestic work and childcare. And we did it. And I'm so glad. I am truly blessed for I had a college education. I lived in New York independently. I did sex positive feminism. I did career feminism. I did little bits of all the feminisms, and I'm grateful for them. But I feel like if we think of this like Betty Friedan, right, getting all the women to be like, identifying you're not happy in the home, literally called the home a concentration camp, leave the house. And now I'm like, all right, maybe we did that and that was good.
Peanut butter sandwiches all the way down.
Right, exactly. Like the misery of making peanut butter sandwiches for kids, which I enjoy. Maybe we can walk back inside the house, thinking and go back in there and be like, all right, maybe this like it was bad in the circumstances. It was too much of it. It wasn't respected in society. But also like maybe it's not all bad. Maybe there's something here that's
Mm-hmm.
worthy of considering. And I think that like care really is that live wire in feminism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where if someone that this came up a lot recently with the whole trad wife commentary
Yeah.
and right, these women who really devote themselves to these traditional lifestyles. And it brings up so many good questions because, like, yes, for sure, that they are in some ways meeting what society demands or expects of
Hmm.
them. But on the other hand, like, who are we to say that people don't genuinely get a sense of purpose and meaning and satisfaction from childcare and domestic work?
Yeah, and I think it
And
goes beyond just what we or they get out of it and gets to the kind of measurable questions that you get in your section on the economy of what actually is building the economy. And if you took all that caregiving out, unremunerated, unpaid as it might be, nevertheless, the economy, it would crash the economy actually because, and so forth. So I think you make a good argument. I guess early in the book, you say, what I'm asking for here isn't for us to deny women the power of going away or to deny the difficulty of care, but for us to see both going away and staying home as something challenging, potentially life-changing experiences. What I want is for someone to also describe a picture of women doing care as, quote, an image about power, about freedom, about trusting oneself, or even better, a man. And that really brings me back to my own life experience. And once again, I just want to say that I think there's a bigger problem here than simply how women see themselves or how culture sees women. And I want to define it in a different way and then get you to talk about that. I think there's an overarching way to describe everything your book is, and that is it challenges our idea of what a successful human being is. And basically, you are redefining what you mean by the word success. So if success is only money and only power over others, then my wife, Jeannie, right now is a failure because she retired from running a publishing company. And all she does is take care of grandchildren and do needlepoint and design clothes in her studio, which could be dismissed as some sort of, fill the hours hobby, which it's not because she's brilliant, but that's a different question. But seen from a different point of view, the reason those 6 teenage girls all want to grow up someday to be old like Jeannie Schaeffer is because she's one of the most joy-filled, kindest, together, smartest, compassionate people they will ever meet. And plus, she looks good and they want to be her. When you get to be 73, you want to be like Jeannie.
I
So,
do. I want to be right.
yeah,
Right.
her idea of success is not measurable on any chart that Elon Musk would understand. She doesn't
Right.
sleep under her desk to work all night. She didn't have her kids to populate Mars. She's not going around the world doing surrogacy for people so that she can, get the sperm of geniuses and turn us into a super race or put chips in our brains or upload herself to a computer. Her idea of success is that our home is where all our grandchildren would rather be always because she's there and I'm here too, I might say, adding to that. It's a completely different idea of success. And I just want to say one more thing. If you measure it in terms of economic return, the fact that her children and grandchildren are going to, quote, do well, male and female, as measured by that other standard, ought to be something too. They know who they are. They've always been loved. Her great talent is to love well, and she always has.
Yeah.
And she's sending people into the world of the kind that demographers all wish we had more of. So even measured in that sterile, horrible, Muskian SpaceX go to the thing way, even there, Jeannie wins. And I'm really tired of a culture that doesn't recognize that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of research and data that shows that when kids receive good care and their parents are able to give them that good care and have the support necessary, they become higher functioning adults. They contribute more to society, both just as humans in the civic kind of collective sense, and also they are better and more productive employees. So
Yeah,
it's right, these things are all connected.
yeah.
And, so my book is split between the first half really looks at the societal value of good care and our
Hmm.
collective experience. And the second half is focused on what care can do for us as people and what
Yeah,
we
exactly.
get from care. And I feel like overall it's really a roadmap to valuing care
Hmm.
as a culture. It's not a policy book. I dip a little bit into it, like 3 paragraphs, a little bit. At the end, I feel like there's many brilliant policy experts, but I feel
Hmm.
like care had never been subjected to a real, like, systemic questioning of its value for
Yeah,
us as humans. You know, it's in siloed ways it has, right? Anthropologists, as you mentioned, and but but it's never someone trying to take a big picture look of like what is actually the value of care for me as a
yeah,
person in the world I live in.
yeah.
And I hope again that the book really serves as a roadmap for people to understand that, and policymakers read it and are like, oh, yeah, this is why we should invest in supporting caregivers. And, husbands who may not want to help their wives with care read it and they realize, okay, actually, this is
Maybe I
as
could do
rich as
this.
going on that meditation retreat for
Yeah,
6 days, to be silent in the woods versus care for a newborn, both very demanding.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
you know,
You start your book, literally, this is how you open it. And we've been going through different passages, but this is how you begin it. I went into motherhood determined not to lose myself in it. The obliteration of who I was, or who I thought I was, who I could be, or thought I could be, all felt inevitable without a conscious defense. When my first son was born in 2012, I believed I was ready. By then, I had spent over a decade reading, admiring, and aggressively underlining many feminist marquee name books by the likes of Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, and Virginia Woolf. They were all different thinkers with different agendas, living in different circumstances, times and circumstances. I'm not going to ask you to talk about that, but I'm going to say yours has been an interesting track because, to my surprise, fortunately, I didn't read anything about your book. I just read the book, which is always a good thing. um, so I get to the last chapters, and you now are going to what would be the equivalent of me going back to church, but you're in synagogue or temple or whatever, and
mhm.
you're experiencing the religious life. So I want to talk about that because you write about it in your book. And I'm not saying what about the caregiving experience has led you into to look again at spirituality and religion, because it leads me there all the time. I mean, that's inevitable. You're going, this is the big question. What do I care about most? I mean, that's it. What is the purpose of life? Um, so I didn't find it unusual or surprising, but I know this is going to sound odd, and I don't want to go where angels fear to tread, but like all
Please do. Yeah.
authors, yeah, like all authors, and I do this all the time, okay? So I was just talking to a friend of mine who teaches writing, who's reading something I'm writing right now, and I'm trying to get some notes from her. And I said, let's cut to the chase here. It's over footnoted, and I quote a lot of people because I have something to prove, and that is I want people to take what I'm saying seriously. And the real part of the book that comes from me is not the footnotey bit of quoting people. It's it's what resonates with me. But, I have an inferiority complex when it comes to this stuff. I'm a man writing about these issues of caregiving. And on the other hand, so I have something to prove. So look for that stuff and be strict with me. Don't let me do that. Now, my question to you, with having set that up, is there are sections of your book, as in, for instance, trying to explain what sort of feminist you're not anymore, but what you do believe. And then when you get to the religion section, you're Jewish, but you're careful to quote other religions. It's not just us, which I understand, because otherwise you come off like a fanatic. But when you got to that next session of your book, just like polite dinner table conversation doesn't involve politics or religion, or it didn't used to, you're getting into religion and you're saying, okay, I'm doing all this stuff. Did you hear doors slamming, as in who's going to publish now? Because I'm pulling the religion card for meaning out instead of just doing the care card. Did you have discussions with an editor? Did you have discussions with yourself? How much of that did you have to couch in terms that would be acceptable to people? Whereas if it was just you and me over a cup of coffee without anybody listening and you trusted me, where's the real you on the journey as opposed to how you present yourself publicly when it comes to religion? Just like I ask myself, where's the real me on my male journey to caregiving and how I really feel about relationships as opposed to how I'm packaging it for skeptics? I know that's an odd question.
Yeah. So I think, if it's because we're talking about God, right? As something,
Yeah.
a mystery as big and strange as this thing we call God. I have a few different answers that may or may not contradict each other. So I think overall, it's definitely vulnerable for me to talk about my faith in a book like this that's really marketed to an
Yeah,
audience that's not necessarily, a God audience. They're probably maybe a spiritual audience, kind of goop spirituality, which I'm not trying to reduce either.
yeah,
That's a real thing for people. It's really meaningful for them, but not people who live in the mind frame of seeing real value, of actually having a
sure.
sense of obligation to a specific faith and its rules, and feeling like they get something from that. I do. I have that sense. I am not a strictly observant Jew. They're
Right.
on the spectrum of Judaism. I'm not even probably quite in the middle, or maybe I'm just about in the middle.
Sure, sure.
But
I
there's a
understand.
whole world of far more observant Jews than me. But still, there are things I do because I'm supposed to do them, and
Hmm.
I appreciate that experience, and of the letting go of trying to wrestle with everything myself. And so,
Yeah.
and it's a part that I can't fully articulate. And it's a part that I worry, just like liking motherhood, I worried it would make me seem silly and, an unreliable narrator among certain readers. Same with admitting that I have a faith practice, and I do have a belief in this thing we call God. I think that there's something, in the particular to doing this from a Jewish perspective. In Judaism, we kind of joke like we don't really have a theology. It's a
Sure.
less overt theology than other religions have. There's the sense, right, that Israel literally means God wrestlers.
Yeah.
It's a sense of wrestling and question asking.
Yeah.
I think, I often like talking about being Jewish. It's like Judaism's a verb more than a noun, right? It's
Hmm.
like something, it's a way of being instead of a belief system. It's a way of trying to figure things out rather than already knowing X, Y, and Z, beyond this general idea that there's oneness, right? That God is,
Hmm.
we come from oneness, and we are oneness. So that's one piece that I think for me, maybe like in the way I approach Judaism made it a little less scary. And I think in terms of like what I think the heart of what maybe what you're really asking now that we have that frame around it, of what does this like mean still for my faith? I wrote about how care really fed my faith. And again, I don't know how much it fed my faith in God as opposed to my need for God. My
Hmm.
need for, I think I forgot exactly how I put it in the book, but a container for the chaos. I think
Yeah.
I have a phrase, a mystery only as big as God will do. Like the
Hmm.
awe of creating other humans
Hmm.
and watching them grow is so big. I need some system to put it in. I need like a filing system. And this is the
Yeah.
best one I have?
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that I can always access what I feel and think of as God in every day or every time I'm doing anything ritualistically Jewish or every time I'm with my kids. It's hardly like every moment feels charged with a holiness. But it's something that is really there for me and
Hmm.
resets me. And that's, most pronounced in the weekly Jewish ritual, the Sabbath of
Mm.
we still have it as like a standing Friday night dinner with our kids. My older one
Yeah.
may start resisting it in a few years when he gets into the deeper teen years, and I'm prepared
Hmm.
for that. I don't ever want our religion to feel so rigid that they feel that they don't see the beauty
Mm.
of it. There's some rules, but not only rules. But for now, we still have this sense that we have something called Shabbat, and we every Friday night we sit at the table and we light the candles and we say the blessings, and it brings us to a slightly different space mentally than we are the
Hmm.
rest of the week, and where we can kind of reacquaint ourselves with ourselves and each other. And I think like I always can find this thing I call God at the Shabbat
Mm.
table
Mm.
every week, of just like really seeing my kids, of being able to harness in myself a deeper, pure attention to
Hmm.
them, and in doing so, a deeper and pure attention to myself.
Yeah, I think the subject that you're going into inevitably kind of goes there in that, again, we're talking about meaning and sacrifice because you don't pretend that it's not difficult being a parent and loving. Loving is hard. People sometimes ask Jeannie, how he quote unquote stayed married for 54 years, which she has especially when they get to know me. And, one of her things, and it sounds glib, is just you push on through. It's not just, you're looking for the silver lining. There's no kind of other way. There's just one way forward on anything. It's like, how do you write a book? People tell me they want to be a writer. And my first question to them, and I'm not trying to be an asshole, sounds like it. Well, what did you write this morning?
Yeah.
Because the problem is not getting an agent. It's did you get up and write? And I think it's the same with these subjects. So inevitably, you lead towards meeting. And then, of course, with someone like me, you become this kind of hypocrite that on one hand is very critical of religion, but on the other hand says grace at the table when my grandchildren come over, because I want them to have some sense that the goodness of life, you have to thank someone for it. Even if there's nobody there, the idea of being in a spirit of thanksgiving is not a bad thing to grow up with. And
And
writing
maybe
about
that
this,
goodness is the God.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Maybe that thing you're summoning is God. Like, did we create God in our image, or is God,
yeah,
or did God create us in God's image? Like, maybe it
yeah.
doesn't matter in the end, right? Like, we created this thing called God to capture this energy we can create among
Mm.
us that you're summoning and like just, or you at least bracketing and pointing out at the table through that grace. Or sometimes for me, it doesn't actually matter which direction it goes. It's
Mm.
almost all the same.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's something. I have a daughter who happens to be a CEO of a company in New York, and she's doing all that fancy stuff that the kind of people who read your columns in the New York Times would recognize as valid. And I have been writing about family and so forth. So I wrote to her and I said, well, what do you think? Because you know what my subject is. And she wrote me an email that actually fit a section of your book, where you talk about learning from this experience. And she says, what I talk about it, you know, conferences where they get me to speak because I'm a woman who's done all this stuff. And you have this nice thing about breaking glass doors as opposed to glass ceilings. And she basically talks about the fact, look, everything that I'm doing in business now, having had kids first and been home with them until they were all in school, hinges on what I learned as a parent. And she said, you can always hear a pin drop. No one wants to hear this. It doesn't fit with what she's supposed to be as a woman
Yeah.
executive, and it doesn't fit with the men either because it doesn't. And then you write about it and you say, the more I began thinking about the home as a place for heroes' journeys and other such, how do you say epiphanic,
I can write it epiphanic. I don't know. I can write it. I don't know if I
epiphanic.
could say it.
Good. I'm glad. I've just, processes, the more I began to realize that this distinction between what happens inside the walls and what happens outside of them is not as firm as I'd long imagined. Our domestic and public spaces, our domestic and public selves, have never been and will never be two entirely separate entities, but instead are intimately entwined. And then you go on and you say, when freedom and independence are the most important things in our personal political lives, then any space in which they are limited will conveniently be seen as inferior. Male thinkers over the ages didn't ignore the existence of the domestic space, but they kept it small, uninteresting, apart from the complexity and the chaos that is real life. And I would just, that's the end, what I'm reading there, but I would add, but of course, that's the same fallacy in reverse of certain elements of the feminist movement, and where I would look back at some of the reading I've done over the years and the people I've known personally, and discussed with, in the context of my own writing, it's that same narrowness. And so, what the men did for centuries in terms of the patriarchal society and in the pushback against it, very few people did what you did. And that is to say, yeah, but I'm trying to come up with something that isn't and or, but both. And I think your book's very refreshing that way. I just would give you an opportunity to talk about that a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think in many ways we've all been living like this forever. I mean, even if you are a man, associate yourself as a caregiver, you became who you were through care. I mean,
Yeah.
there's an abundant body of psychological research, attachment theory, and whatnot that shows that like all of our capabilities to function as adults are rooted
Mm-hmm.
in receiving good, attuned caregiving as children. So we all come from care. We're not just born and set free to be, to go on our mighty independent journeys. Like we at least are born from that place of attunement. And then, too few of us then grow up to see what it to appreciate what it's like to give that attunement on the other side, to
Hmm.
receive through the giving of care, not just the getting of care.
You say in the book, in 2016, the Pew Research Center published data on gender and religion among 6 faiths in over 84 countries and found that, quote, globally, women are more devout than men by several standard measures of religious commitment, end quote. One reason, according to a number of sociologists, is that women's firsthand knowledge of the beginning and the end of life makes it much harder to walk around acting like one has all the answers. Boy, that that rang so true with me in terms of just, and I would add, and I would say, by the time you get to my age and you're talking about having grandchildren and half your friends are dying or dead, and you yourself have start cascading health threats, then the kind of glib compartmentalization of life into job versus the things that give me meaning, it either, to sustain that in the midst of facing real questions about mortality, for instance, just like you're talking about women, the start of life. I think part of that is just the wisdom of growing older. If you're not one of these tech bros who apparently don't get any wiser, they just become more self-centered. But the rest of us, or a lot of people, are drawn into looking at things, like I said before, kind of redefining for yourself what the word success means. And it's not what we're being told it means. One last thing, and then we'll go. What do you think about the climate in which kids are trying to grow older today and grow up? I'm not going to talk about iPhones and all the rest. We know what we think about that. But this passing on of a different idea of success, that who are you, not what are you going to do, not what is your career, but what is passionately non-negotiable in your life. And I think I'm a grandparent and I'm happy, and I have really older grandchildren because Jessica had her kids young too. So I have 30-year-old grandchild, and I meet so many people my age who are barely having kids at all. My younger grandchildren are the age of their children because everything's been gone. So a whole
Right.
intergenerational thing. Just do the math. Like the grandparents are either very elderly or dead because everybody's moving along. And I meet people my age who look at me a bit enviously. And I don't sometimes talk about the joy of being a grandfather and the caregiving I give, because it's like talking to someone who's in chemotherapy about how well you're feeling.
Yeah.
It's not fair. But in my head, I have a little cruel dialogue going on. And that was, when your daughter or your son was in college, were you telling them that maybe don't get the master's degree if you're in love? Stick with that person. Don't move 3 times for the job and break all the relationships in your life up. And now you're far away from family, former friends. You dumped your girlfriend because you thought there might be somebody hotter or better or more something, or that you were, it was going to be a capstone. You were going to wait till you got this perfect thing going. I just think the boomer generation fed a load of shit to a lot of people when it came to what life is about. I'm not talking about the politics, the feminism, and all
Right,
the
right,
rest of it.
right.
And now, you're looking around now, you don't have any grandchildren because you gave them a set of values in which the priority of connection and love, to love and be loved well, was not on the high list of, you want to get into Harvard or Princeton or Yale, not love or be loved well. And I think we've fed a whole generation of people, and now the piper's being paid. I mean, you look at the demographics and the birth rates and all the rest of it, starting to slide off the edge. I don't know whether you've done any thinking about that. I know your book is sort of about all that, but you're writing from the point of view of a mom. I'm writing from the point of view, or thinking from the
Yeah.
point of view of a grandfather. And I'm looking at people with a very empty, sad expression who are my age, who probably will never have a grandchild because their kids are designed their life to be successful in the way these parents told them they should be. And now you get what you paid for because you're alone.
Yeah, I think another factor there too is, I mean, the kind of myopia we all have, which is the assumption that how things are now is how things will always be. And the boomers raised their family in a particular set of economic conditions in which balancing family life and work felt much more possible. It was much more possible to feel economically prosperous. And of course, that
Sure.
itself is subjective, but I mean, I'll take it down really small scale. All of my friends have smaller houses than we were raised in, right?
Yeah.
So and everything that that implies, right? So I think that's part of it too. It seemed for the boomer generation a little more possible to kind of pursue all these things
Hmm.
and also have a stable family life.
Yeah.
And then you fast forward to our generation, where even with that Princeton degree, you're not actually necessarily going to find yourself in a job that's going to give you all the material comfort you were raised to believe you should have before you can have kids, to whether you're
Hmm.
living in a certain city or have a certain size real estate or own real estate versus renting. And then also on top of it, work has gotten so much more intense. So the lawyer
Yeah.
job of 1984 looks different than the lawyer job of 2024.
Yeah.
So it's everything moved in the wrong direction. You have less economic stability, less
Yeah.
economic prosperity, and the job is so much bigger. So
Hmm.
it's suddenly it's a whole different set of choices.
Yeah. I mean, Jean Twenge quotes somebody in one of her books about, I think it was to do with breastfeeding or something like, why don't I know how to do this? And she said, because you're not in the village has been eroded into non-existence. There's nobody around. And this is one of the areas where I'm inconsistent in my writing because I rail against my evangelical right-wing background on all the harm we did. And then I talk about the fact that Jeannie and I married as teenagers, totally unlikely story of working out. Horrendous, total asshole groomed to be a misogynist pig, basically, because of all that theology of men should be in charge. Took me a big chunk of my life to unlearn it all and turn into somebody different. But that said, one of the reasons we stumbled along through the first 10 years with these young kids was we lived in this little evangelical mission and they got a lot of things wrong, but not childcare, help,
Yeah,
babysitting, sisters down the road. We were literally in a village. And without that, we never would have made it. So you can reject all those ideas and have your nice fancy what career or something instead, or whatever it may be. Hey, I am a big critic of evangelical right-wing Christianity. Why are Jeannie and I still married? Because we had a role model of some evangelical Christians who sometimes were assholes, but they got one thing right, and that is you were never alone as a young couple. You needed
yeah,
help, you had it. Medical bills, insurance, no, you were part of a community. It was taken care of. And of course, um, there would have been a time when I tried to work that out and say something rational about it, but I can disagree with some of the basis of that community, still be very grateful on a human level that I experienced that village life. And so I totally get you gravitating toward religious community. And that's nothing like the one I grew up in, but um, we've thrown a lot of these things away, and I think we've left a lot of people very alone out there. And
right,
even and you talk about this in your book, and it's an area that I've studied some, and that was even on actuarial tables of longevity. The Berlin study shows that grandparents that take care of grandchildren on a regular basis, and they studied, I think, 22,000 people over a 30-year period, so that was a real study, contributes more to longevity than not smoking or hypertension. It's like a huge thing. It adds 7 years to your life. Speaking of uploading your brain to a chip.
right.
Just having that activity in your life. And you refer to something similar. I forget which study you cite, if you had cite one, but I mean, it's not only on a spiritual basis that we've made mistakes in gravitating away from community and village and caring, but somehow, evolution's tapping us on the shoulder and saying, hello, you're going to die younger.
Right.
Loneliness will kill you. You weren't designed to be by yourself. Excuse me, and you don't hear that in the popular culture. You don't see that theme of like, excuse me, you're an evolved animal and you were built a certain way to function, and you're pushing against that by defining success as something other than connection. You're going to pay a price, and people are. All the loneliness, suicides, everything else happening. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to start.
Right. And you're making me think about how community is inevitably inconvenient, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's something we don't really want to deal with, but on the other hand, there are communities that really do have principles and beliefs that we rightfully just may feel are not the way we want to live our lives. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's always a tension, right? When you find yourself in community, understanding that you're not going to agree with everything. And I think honestly, the people who are in communities, like thick, rich communities, they often very aware that they don't agree with everything
Sure,
in their
absolutely.
community. And I think that's from people who aren't in those communities don't understand. My friends
Hmm.
who haven't had a lot of exposure to Orthodox Jews don't understand what I do by being related to some and friends with some. That actually they don't all, it's not like they all agree about everything. Some
No,
have computers under their beds and they go on the internet at night and they really honestly don't think God is going to be mad at them, even if their rabbi tells them they're not supposed to do it. So,
yeah.
I think that if we're not living in these thick communities, we assume that in order, the price of entry is fully erasing the self and getting
Yeah.
on board with every single belief. And I think when you get to know the people in them, in fact, they know there's a lot of contradiction in their lives, but they're willing to live in that contradiction for the sake of being part of a community.
Hmm. Well, you have a very good set of passages in your book about this kind of male idea. I'm out there, I'm alone, I'm climbing, I'm doing the hero on the ridge kind of thing. And of course, the culture's absorbed that, but somehow, you push outward, you get on a motorcycle and cross the country on, Route 66, whatever. That's the thing. And then the women sort of adopted that, saying, okay, I'll be alone and I'll push out. Sooner or later, everybody limps back to some sort of community, even if it's an online thing of crazy
Yeah.
incels moaning and groaning because they're loathsome males that no one wants to hook up with. I mean, we all end back in some deal. I love your phrase, community is inconvenient, but there's something worse most of the time, as opposed to the most oppressive communities which flee. Pity the Afghan woman in Afghanistan today who can't even talk anymore if her voice is overheard in public. I mean, that's not a community, that's an apartheid system. But
Right.
without those extremes, the worst thing about, there's something worse than most communities, and that's no community. And trying to raise a child outside of any village,
Yeah.
and that's the world we've created.
Yeah. It's
And your book is the antidote. Hold it up again.
all right.
So there it is.
Yeah.
When You Care, Elissa Strauss, she's wonderful. Her writing is luminous. We're going to make it a book club thing. Half the people I admire most are her sources in her book. And I just cannot tell you how grateful I am to meet you as a fellow traveler. And we're generations apart. I'm a male and a grandfather, and you and I are best friends without even knowing each other because your life experience is basically telling me you're not an idiot.
I love that.
You're telling me I'm not an idiot.
Yeah.
72-year-old male, raised in an evangelical, weird mission, and you're reaching out to me, Frank Schaeffer, and saying, keep going. I'm on the same road, and you and I are discovering some things together. I loved it. It was like a book of self-discovery. It was lovely.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot to
Yeah,
me.
and so beautifully written. I mean, hats off to you. A hug through the screen. And Ernie will get back to you. And by the way, when I click off here, because I'll have to go away now, please stay on and talk to my producer for a minute,
Sure.
because he will be asking you if you have somebody we ought to be talking to, just like Ruth told us about you, so we went from Boy Mom to your book, and there's got to be people you're saying, have you talked to so and so? She's a friend of mine, I'll, whomever, and we'll make it a book club thing and do anything we can to help you or your book. So we'll list anything, we'll link to
Thank
anything,
you.
we will promote the hell out of it. Thank you for your kindness and for your love and your compassion to people. And I was touched by it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, talk soon.